Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today's episode is going to be a brief one, speaking to those who are subjected to the California wildfires right now. And frankly, this episode probably, I hope, would be applicable regardless. Anytime there's a natural disaster or some sort of tragedy, I hope there's kernels of truth in this episode that could be useful. But that is what is prompting this particular episode: is the wildfires actively going in California here in early 2025. And I understand that there are some still going on, and so note that this episode is more so for after the fact. This is not meant to support those who are actively trying to live through the moment. This is more picking up the pieces as the risks continue, hopefully, to go down for many residents. I'm going to traverse three primary things. One is just speaking briefly to the power of community. Cliche as it might be, it's such an important variable when these things happen. Number two, where I'm kind of probably spend most of my time, is talking about trauma. I mean, this is a traumatic event. It does not mean that you are traumatized. That's a subjective term, one. But just, speaking to like how you can lean into distress and the stress of all of this, and see where it might fit for you. And then maybe a brief mention on survivor's guilt. So first, talking about community. I mean, my whole premise, my whole approach to most of the things I do in psychology is relational psychodynamic. And the central premise is that we are born to relate. It is, sort of just a strange tragedy that as we have become more interconnected, I feel like community has started to fall apart more and more. It's harder to find a sense of community. Now, I am sure there's community out there in California, but I would implore folks that during this time of tragedy to reach out to your neighbors, your literal neighbors, but also just the cities in general, and look for opportunities to connect. I've cynically offered in my self-destruction episodes, like, why is it that we have to wait for tragedy to form bonds with one another? Shouldn't we be able to do that more proactively? But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't lean in when tragedy strikes. That I'm recommending that we be sort of suspicious of community just because it follows tragedy. There's no better time. There's no better time to lean into community than now, to talk to one another, to share experiences, and this will lead to point two, to process through what happened, and to rebuild together, to volunteer together, to hold one another, to speak to one another. It is of utmost importance. Just to impress upon you how important I think this is, if someone were to come to me and say, like, hey, I would like to get treatment, like actual formal treatment, given what I've gone through, and then false dichotomy, this is, you can do both or none or one. If someone came to me and like, I want to choose between going to one-on-one therapy or like a group being offered based on this fire and what I experienced, what would you recommend? I would recommend the group over one-on-one. Now, again, you could do both. One-on-one is wonderful. I love that there's tons of therapists out there in California offering pro bono services for this. But if you have an opportunity to join a group, I would say join that group. Truly, there's no better time for being around people who have had a shared experience than now. So again, I'm not saying you have to do group therapy or something like that, but just to impress upon you how big I think community is, that's how big I think community is. Reach out, be with one another, heal together. So let's talk about trauma. I mean, this is an objectively traumatic experience. It does not mean that you personally have been traumatized. That varies person to person. Some people will develop post-traumatic stress disorder because of this. Others will not. And I'm not here to kind of litigate when, why, or whatever, but just kind of speaking to how you might encounter this traumatic experience. One, some people might already be in the active throes of this, and just note, diagnostically, theoretically, we already account for this through what's called an acute stress disorder, that it is not uncommon when you go through significant life-threatening events such as this, that you will have lots of post-traumatic-like symptoms of just like sudden memories of the things that you have personally experienced or that you have seen. Feelings of avoidance or uncertainty or arousal around, those experiences, aspects of questioning yourself and the world. The world is unsafe. It's unpredictable. Anything could ever happen. I thought things were okay and suddenly they're not. It's just feeling more anxious and on edge. All those sorts of things can be quite normal, and there might be many out there in California that are already experiencing these things, and that means that you're actively moving through this traumatic and very stressful experience. That being said, many people will not be. They will not be in those spaces, and that's completely normal too. False dichotomy, this is not exactly how it goes, but just to kind of give a sense of like where those folks who maybe aren't experiencing the stress and anxiety might be at. One, they're already actively processing through. They're living in these moments, not 100%, but they are encountering the tragedy. They are noticing things. They are actively processing and feeling and working through. Like, oh my gosh, this is surreal. To I am sad. To I'm just pissed that this happened. And so they're actively processing through, which usually aids and guards against post-traumatic or acute stress-like symptoms. That's a good thing. And there's some people who just don't need as much of that. There are, I think, those of us who kind of are accustomed to high stress scenarios. There is a certain resiliency that just not as much processing is needed to move through these traumatic experiences. Again, these are the firefighters of the world. Not saying that they won't be traumatized, but you want people like that in the world because they just their distress tolerance is very high, and so there could be many of those folks. But there's also the possibility that there's still folks out there that are in kind of like a go mode. This is a fight or flight response. It's evolutionarily very important. It allows you to get shit done when you need to get shit done, when you are surviving, you are trying to get through this moment. And the warning, not trying to sound like catastrophizing here, but the warning here is the stress and the anxiety and the emotions and then all that kind of stuff could hit at a delay. And to those folks, I'd recommend this to basically anybody. Be sure that you are grounding as you settle in and that you have less of a necessity for the go mode, that you try to ground a little bit and just be like, where am I at? What am I feeling? Can I get in touch with what has happened so that I'm not just constantly going, well, let's just go straight into recovery. Let's process what has happened. You got to ground yourself first, feel the feels, emotionally, somatically, go through the memories, and then start processing through and going, what was that like? Like, oh my God, that was just going back to what I said earlier. That was so surreal. I mean, that was crazy. And then there's another part of me just heartbroken that all of this has happened and just at a loss for losing my house or my memories or whatever it might be. And feeling all the feels and really rolling through all of that and looking for any potential cues of like the world is now unsafe. Everything is unpredictable. I cannot secure my safety again. Anything that feels too black and white, anything that just feels too stark and too negatively skewed, be careful of those. Because reality is usually a balance between those two forces. The tragedy teaches us a really unfortunate lesson. The world is often not as safe as we think it to be, but it does not mean that we are inherently unsafe or that tragedy is around every corner, et cetera, et cetera. So just look out for those black and white ways of thinking and experiencing things, and you kind of guard against those and soften. And that is also best done through and with other people. That healing process might be more economical, let's say it frankly, more efficient if done with other people who have been through it. This is often the challenging thing for folks with traumas, like say childhood traumas, is they isolate themselves and there's something very unique about their experience and it isn't all communally shared, whereas it is very much shared in the fires right now. I mean, there are hundreds, thousands of people going through not exactly the same thing, but very similar. And so healing together. So hopefully that helps. I mean, again, I'm not saying everybody's going to be traumatized. I'm not saying it's bad if you do develop, post-traumatic stress because of this. But just kind of watch out for yourself. Kind of try to catalog as things calm down where you are at and what you might need to try to guard against any potential slide into something more problematic. And watch for warning signs: eating, sleeping, energy level. Suppression, just avoidance, kind of dissociation, and kind of a little bit overused word these days, but just tendency like you're just breezing through your days and you can barely remember them. Warning signs that you might want to slow down and process more. Last but not least, survivor's guilt. This is a big one because of how much destruction there is. There are going to be many who make it out okay. I mean, even people who have lost their homes might be subjected to survivor guilt if somebody they know died in the fire, or perhaps somebody lost more, or whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be loss of life. It could be loss of things. So just note that that's okay. That you might have some guilt and some remorse of just like, gosh, I was spared, but so many other people weren't, and it just feels unfair and unjust, and I feel ashamed, and I don't want to share, like, think about this community thing. Like, I don't want to go out there in public and be around other people who've lost their houses when I was so lucky and I did not lose my house. Trust me, I mean, if someone is mad at you for coming in looking for support simply because you did not lose your house, I wouldn't pay much mind. If you're there gloating or constantly making about you when someone's lost their house, they might get rightfully pissed off at you. But if you're just out there trying to gain support and be with community too, try not to compare yourself and say like, well, what am I to be sad about? What am I, I didn't lose that much. It's like, well, there's a both end. Be grateful for sure. Gratitude is important, but that doesn't mean that you can't be sad and afraid and all those sorts of things just because you did not lose as much as your neighbor or other people in your city or community. So that's it. I want to keep this relatively short. My heart goes out to folks experiencing this. I mean, it's just wild. I mean, wildfires and natural disasters in of themselves are very challenging, but the breadth of destruction and the breadth of the effect is just, it's so much. So I want to make this quick episode in case it might be helpful, and seek out more, right? If you happen to land on my tiny channel, keep seeking out other mental health channels if it's of use and utility to you as you continue to navigate this tragedy. So as always, thank you for listening and or watching, and stay curious together. Thanks so much.